Well, good evening. This is another episode of National Divorce Talk Raw, but it's kind of a subset. This will be part of our continuing discussion on the fact that the United Nations isn't working. It's not having the credibility that it enjoyed previously, and that the world needs a new global discussion center based for the upcoming century, not the past one. Now, in my book, I had proposed that could be California. That just as Switzerland was the global communications center in the 1800s, early 1900s, and was the source and inspiration for the United Nations, that so too, given the world's demographics and the power players in the scene now, California should be the new Switzerland for the next century, that we need a new United Nations, and that the best place for this United Nations would be here in California for this reason. And we'll get right to it. Let's do the intro first. We'll be right back. A lot of Californians aren't very familiar with these facts. Let me show you them right here. These are things that we talk about routinely in the Cal-Exit movement, but are less known amongst more of the mainstream public. Here's the first one. In 2007, the United Nations said President Ban Ki-moon, that's Ban Ki-moon on the left of Arnold Schwarzenegger in that picture, Secretary General Ban Ki-moon in California on a trip aimed at spotlighting the issue of climate change today praised the state for taking measures to foster energy efficiency and invited Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger to United Nations talks on the issue this September. During a joint press conference with the governor and the president of the United Nations, Mr. Ban called for measures to foster conservation, renewable fuels, and private market incentives. What's missing, the president of the UN said, is political will and political leadership. Mr. Ban praised Governor Schwarzenegger of California, saying he has demonstrated what a difference leadership can make. Mr. Ban pledged to encourage world leaders to embrace a similarly bold vision, one that can be applied beyond this golden state to the entire world. He also invited the governor to attend a high-level meeting on the issue that the Secretary General is convening in New York on September 24th. It will be very useful for other world leaders to hear from your vision and your experience, the UN leader told the California governor. Initiatives by states and local government levels or individual government initiatives, they are very welcome. So what happened was the world stalled on climate change. They knew climate change was an issue. They knew they needed to come up with regulations. The United Nations couldn't do it. The EU couldn't do it. America couldn't do it. The International Monetary Fund could do it. Everybody was too terrified of coming up with climate change regulations, although they needed them. And then California, not even an official separate nation, did it all on its own. And California did such a good job at convening multiple nations together to get an understanding on climate change that the United Nations, the Global Communications Center, said, you know what, California, you're doing our job for us. You're doing such a good job at getting the world to talk about climate change legislation and developing climate change legislation that the world needs to have happen, that you should continue the conversation, California. And we want you to act like a nation and come to these meetings. And we're going to tell the rest of the nations in the world to follow your example. So on climate change around 2007, 2008, California led the entire planet and was so demonstrably a leader on climate change that the World Discussion Center said, you're doing our job for us and better than we can do it. And why don't you keep doing it? That's what the UN said. News, United Nations. Here you go. Here's the other thing a lot of people don't talk about was that, notice this is 2007, 2008, when California is doing climate change and getting world recognition. Then in 2009, the mayor of San Francisco, currently Governor Newsom, proposed creating a UN site in California, the United Nations of Hunters Point. San Francisco Mayor Gavin Newsom wants to put a United Nations center focused on global warming at Hunters Point. The proposed center, called the United Nations Global Compact Center, would cost about 16 to 20 million, which is almost nothing. And finally, I need to show you this. Okay, so the United Nations has multiple offices. So there's not just one United Nations in New York. There's a United Nations in Nairobi, Kenya. That's an official UN station, just like the one in New York, in Nairobi, Kenya. There's also a UN office in Austria, United Nations of Vienna, Austria. There it is. That's a full-on United Nations building that does United Nations thing. There's obviously the United Nations in New York that exists. And then there's also a United Nations in Switzerland, if I'm not mistaken. Geneva, the UN system, the United Nations. So there's not just one United Nations in New York. There's one in Nairobi, Kenya, one in Austria, one in Switzerland, and one in New York. Okay. So now you know that California has proposed a UN here in California in 2009, and it was by our current governor. And you know that California did such a good job on climate change that it was basically recognized as doing the UN's work for it in 2007, 2008. And in my book in 2012, I said, these international negotiation centers, the IMF, the World Bank, the UN, they're not working because they don't have credibility and people don't feel that they're fair. Basically, the global South, as evidenced during the Russian invasion of Ukraine, doesn't necessarily have the same opinions about the rules-based international order created by America that Europe, Japan, South Korea, and America do. They don't feel it's fair. That's why they don't feel the UN's fair. They don't feel these international institutions are fair to them. And they don't have much credibility. So therefore, if these international institutions don't have credibility to the world and aren't seen as credible, then we're going to need a new UN that would have credibility. And as I pointed out in my book, where's the place with Indians, Chinese, Russians, Americans, Europeans, Asians, Latins? It's California. There is no place in the world that's as diverse. There is no place that has as large a conglomeration of Chinese, Indians, Americans, Europeans, and Latin people anywhere on the earth. And those are the future 5 superpowers. It's us. We're the only place that even comes close. Suriname might have some background, maybe Singapore, but really nothing compared to California. And given our world's places, the world's 5th largest economy, and the fact that we are known by the entire planet for Hollywood, Silicon Valley, smartphones, and the internet, we could easily take on that role. But today's show is about proving to you that the United Nations and these global negotiation centers do not have credibility, are changing, and we need to have something to replace them. A lot of people don't know this. My suggestion is that it's California. But even if it's not, the big news is that these international centers are not working. And we need a new one for world peace. So there you go. The international rules-based order was made by America, and its rules are ignored by America. So I'm going to show you a bunch of clips showing how the international rules-based order is falling apart. There's nothing to replace it. And how people who are not in the West don't believe it's a fair system and therefore don't give it credibility. And that means that the UN can't do things like get binding resolutions punishing Russia for its invasion of Ukraine because half the planet doesn't think the UN's fair. You've seen this in other episodes of California's the UN, where they tried to punish Russia for its invasion of Ukraine, and you had about half the countries in the world for it, and about half the countries were against it. We saw that when they tried to remove Russia from the UN Human Rights Council. It was 50-50, basically. Half for, half against. That was not the entire world is united against Russia. And I point at that because it shows something that I predicted in my book in 2012. These global negotiation centers aren't seen as fair, and so they're not seen as credible by a majority of the world's population. And we saw that play out writ large with the failure of the West to get Russia kicked out of the UN Human Rights Council and have the entire world back up America and Europe. Half of the world backed them up and half of the world disagreed with them. All right, let's show you some of the examples of why people don't think the UN's fair. So the first thing we're going to do is, I'll show you this. This is an article, the liberal international order is over. What will replace it, by Andrew Latham, 5th month of this year in The Hill. The Hill is a well-respected political magazine. And basically what he says is this: we no longer live in a world defined by norms, rules, and institutions of the liberal international order, recently rebranded as the rules-based international order. In partial recognition of these seismic changes that have taken place, we have grown very accustomed to thinking and talking as if the planet were governed through a single operating system, one structured around essentially liberal rules of democracy, free markets, human rights, peaceful resolution of disputes. But that operating system, built by the US in 1945 and coming fully into its own with the demise of the Soviet Union in 1991, is giving way to something new and qualitatively different. It is not clear yet precisely what this new operating system will look like, but one thing is certain: our nostalgic delusion that this is still the 1990s, notwithstanding the new laws, technical standards, and other norms around which the world politics will be organized in coming years, will reflect China's interest and values as much as the United States, I would argue, in addition to other countries. So here's someone saying that the rules-based order was created by America and that it's falling apart, and we don't know what's going to replace it. So that's this guy saying that. Okay. Now let's take a look at how China feels about the UN and the international rules-based order, and if they feel that it's fair. This is an interview, May 27, 2022, on The Point, U.S. Not Seeking a New Cold War, really. And what they're talking about was Anthony Blinken, the Secretary of State, I believe, for the United States government, criticized China for its persecution of the Muslims in the Xinjiang province near the border with the Middle East. And here's what the Chinese representative had to say. So the Americans criticized China. You don't treat those Muslims in your country fair, and therefore you're a bad country and you don't do well with human rights. And here's what the Chinese had to say about that.
We're supposed to have the moral high ground to make up such a story, the genocide, to accuse a country which actually trying to take care of their own people. Now, so China actually take a much mild, much peaceful way to deal with the terrorist extremists in the land. China never launched a war, for example, against the so-called terrorism. China never going to use weapons, use bombs, use machine guns to deal with the so-called extremists. We know that extremist terrorism exists all over the world. And in that part, I think the United States also has a strong possibility. All right. Regarding the first question.
So I just want to point out the CGTN is funded in whole or part by the Chinese government. So you're supposed to look at this and know that that's biased. But is it? Anthony Blinken goes on TV and says, I represent America, China. You treat the Muslims in China horribly, and therefore you're on the back burner with human rights. To which the Chinese respond and say, didn't you invade multiple Muslim countries? Didn't you get 67,000 civilians killed in Afghanistan and 500 to 250,000 civilians killed in Iraq? Didn't you violate the international rules in order to invade that country of Iraq? And didn't you violate the international rules to invade the country of Libya, also a Muslim country? And didn't you drop a bunch of bombs on those people, blow up their country, blow up their infrastructure, and get a bunch of them killed? Well, yes, we've killed a few Uyghurs. And yes, we put a lot of them in prison. But America, didn't you just round up Iraqis who were of the Sunni ethnic group and assume they were terrorists and then put them in places like Abu Ghraib and Camp Bucca and torture them by having them be raped by dogs. Didn't you do that, America? So when we Chinese gather up a lot of our Muslims and we put them in prison camps, that's much worse than you gathering up a bunch of Muslims at random and having them raped by dogs, blown up their country, and killing hundreds of thousands of them as civilians. He's got a point. Again, you won't see this in America, and you would be discouraged from watching it by this thing saying CGTN is funded in whole or in part by the Chinese government, meaning that they're unfair and what they say is biased and not true. So, but this guy is speaking the truth.
The best workers,
Yes.
United States workers. I can understand because we Chinese, we also say that we Chinese workers are most, industrious, and we should be proud of ourselves. I actually tolerate on that. I think that I agree with the previous guest said this is election year. But on the other hand, I think as Americans, they deserve to be proud of themselves. They deserve to say that our workers are the best. I think from that point of view, I think I can stand that because other people like Russians, Chinese, Ukrainians, all we say that their people are the best. I think.
Well, the thing is,
from the point of view of the national pride or national identification, I think that's to me. I think that's okay.
the thing is whether it is okay to base your foreign policy on such thinking, such rhetoric, such campaign rhetoric. For instance, he's talking about China posing the most serious long-term challenge or being the most serious and long-term threat to the existing international order, and that China is the only country with both the intent and the power to reshape the international order. So, Professor Nault, what is your view of?
And that quote gets exactly to what this group said here. The new international order will be as much reflecting China's interests and values as the United States. That's what they said here. And that's what they're saying right here. Anthony Blinken is saying the exact same thing as this guy in the Hill magazine. So the world order is changing and China can change it. And China doesn't think America's fair when it talks about who plays by the international rules. Let's take another clip.
Disappear in the longer mention that,
Right.
which is a program, and I think that's good. Drop the confrontation out of his entire speech. I was looking for that word, but it never appeared.
He actually said the U.S. does not want confrontation.
Yes, as only 2 seats left, the challenges and cooperation. So challenges, okay. But when Clinton, I'm sorry, not Clinton, Blinken said that they want cooperate with China, let's keep in mind there is a condition. Or even necessary condition from American point of view for the cooperation. That is, must be in American terms, because he said China is a long-term, most serious challenge to the international order established or led by the United States, which means if China wants to cooperate with the United States, China have to follow the rules made by the United States, have to cooperate with the United States in the context of the so-called international order. United States.
So the order is made by America. And if you want to be part of the international order, it's not actually international, it's America's rules, and you better do what America says. That's how the Chinese view it. And basically, that's correct. I'll show you. Okay, last quote from here, and then we'll move on.
The United States long supported, including things like the World Trade Organization. However, the U.S. is now backing away from some of those institutions, including, let's focus on the World Trade Organization, and criticizing some of it happening within American politics, because, of course, the existing world order was largely designed and implemented by the United States after World War II. Many of the institutions the United States long supported, including things like the World Trade Organization. However, the U.S. is now backing away from some of those institutions, including, let's focus on the World Trade Organization, and criticizing some of its decisions, including decisions that went against the United States. And I think what's happened, therefore, is a kind of on the one hand, the U.S. says it wants a rule-based order, but on the other hand, it doesn't necessarily want to agree to any particular set of rules because the rules it would like to impose are not necessarily the rules that it would want to follow.
And so that is an American on a Chinese show saying, yeah, America, it made this international rules-based order, but it doesn't actually want to follow those rules. And for example, America made the World Trade Organization, but the moment the World Trade Organization started making decisions America didn't like, America started criticizing that institution. Yet at the same time, America's going around and telling everybody, you better respect these institutions. But America doesn't respect these institutions whenever they go against what America wants. That's what that American is saying. Okay. Here's another article. This is in Newsweek. Xi and Putin, two of the world's most powerful men, meet in China with the U.S. absent. They're talking about how China's coming up, and they recently had a meeting with Russia, and America wasn't invited, and that's kind of a sign of the times. This message will likely resound from a larger platform than ever as Washington's world dominance is viewed by some as in decline. The rules-based order set by Washington is in decline as viewed by some. The U.S. has already ceded global hegemony, while its worldwide influence continues to wane. That's from Alexander Cooley, a political science professor at Columbia University's Barnard College. So he too is saying international rules-based order is coming down, and not as many people are wanting to follow the leadership of America. Okay, let's take another clip. Here you go.
Printed it, and the checks went out, which diminishes the value of money and so on and changes things. Yeah. So then the third thing is the rise of a great power to challenge an existing great power. So the rise of China to challenge the United States. In all history, there are world orders. What that means are they're the dominant power. It's like in nature almost, the big bull or something. Anyway, there's the dominant power. And then what happens is in 1945, we entered the American world order. The United States won the war, and it ended. And then in 1945, the winners of the war carved up the world. We had 80% of what was considered money at the time, gold, 80% of the world's money, essentially. We counted for half the world's economy. And the rules were set in the United States, basically. That's why the United Nations is in New York, the World Bank and the IMF are in Washington, D.C., because we began the American century. Okay, and then...
Okay, so right there, you can hear from Ray Dalio, and what he's saying is that America won a war, and it had 80% of all the gold and 50% of the economy. So it basically owned the majority of the wealth on the planet, and it just won a war. And then it says, I'm going to make this international rules-based order for world peace, but I'm going to center everything in my country, and I'm going to design all the rules in a way that works for me. So here's an American talking to another American, backing up what the Chinese think about the international rules-based order, built by the USA over sheer power for the USA to the USA's liking. Okay. Here's another clip. Top experts discuss Russia-Ukraine war, the rise of China, New World Order, Davos Brainstorm 2022. The New World Order is a conspiracy theory which hypothesizes a secret emerging totalitarian world government. Whatever. This was at Davos. This is Samir Saram. He's from India, and he's speaking to India Today at the Davos conference recently, and this is what he says.
I just want to, my final thought on this. I think I'm not sure the world has been creative enough in its pursuit of peace, as it has been in its implementation of measures to respond to the invasion. And by the way, I'm not in any ways condoning what has happened. I think it must be responded to. But I think we will have to, at some point, knock heads and come up with a framework that allows this conflict to end. And perhaps start thinking about a new multilateral arrangement that will prevent similar situations from arising in other parts of the world. Let us be honest here. What was devised in 1945 is no longer valid, relevant, or even going to stand the test of time in the days ahead. We'll have to rethink multilateralism and the global order. And Ukraine is a wake-up call for all of us to invest in pursuit of peace for the decades ahead. Let that be.
So that is a guy from India on India Today saying the world order was built by America after 1945 and it doesn't work and it's not fair and India doesn't view it as fair. And we need to have a new order. And this was basically highlighted by Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The UN was not able to stop Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And it wasn't even really able to come together on a consensus on how to deal with the topic, as we have talked about. When they tried to ban Russia from the UN Human Rights Council, half the world was for it and half the world was against it. That's not consensus. And so the Indians are looking at that going, this world body was supposed to get kind of world consensus on major issues. You couldn't get consensus and you couldn't stop the war. And this is the most important issue, at least in this month. And the UN is effectively helpless to do anything about it and doesn't really have the credibility of India and, as we've seen, China.
A very quick final word, Kishore Mahbubani. You think the pursuit of peace, the war has to end. It's either going to end this year, next year, 5 years. It has to end. And I believe that we should, at the end of the day, the war has to end. It's either going to end this year, next year, 5 years. It has to end. And I believe that we should try and end it as quickly as possible, also to save lives in Ukraine. But as you know, Henry Kissinger just said yesterday at the World Economic Forum that it's better for us to work harder to find solutions. And as a diplomat for 33 years, I would say that good diplomacy at the end of the day can find solutions. And it's called what they call creative fudges. And if creative fudges have to help to save lives and end wars, I think we should do it. And I think, by the way, we should continue to use the United Nations. And to be fair, the United Nations did condemn very clearly the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And don't give up on the UN. The UN.
So there's Indians arguing with Indians about should we give up on the UN. So that's where they're at. Okay, another clip. War in Ukraine and What It Means for the World Order by Ian Bremmer. Ian Bremmer is a well-respected Western commentator on world affairs. Let's take a look at what he has to say.
Challenges are going to be filled with fossil fuels and fossil fuel development. And so I do think that the fact that both of the answers to your question are true in different places on net is more negative for how quickly we can transition.
Just a comment about China. Birgit, I think, who's listening in, asks, what do you believe Xi Jinping is learning from the world's response to the crisis, to the Ukrainian war?
Well, certainly learning that this was a red line for the West. And I think that this would have obviously surprised Putin. I think it would have surprised Xi Jinping as well. Xi Jinping saw Afghanistan. He saw that Merkel was out. He saw that Macron is focused on strategic autonomy. He sees Biden as much more focused on China and Asia. I think that this is a surprise to Xi Jinping. But Xi Jinping also sees that a lot of the world is not with NATO on this issue. 141 countries, if I remember correctly, voted to censor the Russians for their invasion of Ukraine at the United Nations General Assembly. But very large numbers of that 141 are not on board with all of these sanctions against Russia. They're happy with the diplomatic censure, but they need to continue to work with the Russians. The Chinese see that too. The Chinese see just how much more fragmented the global order is. I thought the most significant thing that we've seen from the Chinese so far, two issues. The first is, of course, when Putin went to Beijing.
So here's Ian Bremmer, certainly a Westerner, certainly for the West. And he's talking about how, yeah, when Russia invaded Ukraine, they condemned it, but they couldn't really get consensus at the UN. And so China's looking at this and going, there really isn't a unified world order because, a lot of countries don't believe in the UN, and they couldn't make it happen with Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And here's basically a Westerner saying that China's realizing there isn't a strong cohesive consensus on the world order, and the UN can't exactly get everybody to come together because it's not exactly seen as fair by a lot of the places in the world. Okay, one more clip. So this is from the Diplomat. The Diplomat is a newsletter website that covers diplomacy, and actual diplomats will write in this. This is the difference between America's two wars, insights from Alfredo Torre Hardy by Mercier Quo on May 2nd, 2022. Let's go here. So this is a newspaper for diplomats. Examine the trajectory of U.S. foreign policy from hegemony to squandering of alliances. In the final phase of World War II, was subsequently a network of multilateral organizations. Initiatives and alliances took shape under America's auspices. Throughout this network, the U.S. positioned itself at the head of a potent hegemonic system where legitimacy was sustained by consensual acquiescence. So, America positioned itself as the head of this international global order that was supposed to have consensus. Something we just realized in this clip doesn't exist anymore. There is no more global consensus. That's what Ian Bremmer is saying in 2022, whereas the UN was created for global consensus in 1945. The United States spectrum of allies was as diverse as its capability to articulate the system on behalf of its Cold War objectives. With the collapse of the USSR, the whole community of nations had to find arrangements under this hegemonic system, which henceforth became global. So when the USSR fell, this system America had set up became the only system. And since America set it up as the head of that system, it was now global hegemon of the entire world because the entire world bought into the U.S. international rules-based order after the USSR fell. Incomprehensible under the light of common sense, George W. Bush proclaimed the futility of multilateral cooperation, which in his view constrained the freedom of action to which American power was entitled. This raw unilateralism gravely weakened a system that had served Washington exceedingly well while eroding the countries standing within it. Bush, followed 8 years later by Trump, was simply too much. The latter's dog-eat-dog approach to foreign policy ended up shattering the trust in U.S. leadership. America's allies are finding it exceedingly difficult to tie their future to a country so prone to zigzags and extremes, particularly so as in a few years' time, Washington could be inaugurating a new Trump administration. So George W. Bush invaded Iraq, did not get a UN resolution for it, ripped apart the international rules-based order, caused chaos, violated the UN's sensibility, and got a lot of people killed. And so you can't really believe that America's fair with this international rules-based order that it created when it has George Bush basically say, we don't need the UN's permission, we'll just invade whoever we want, we can launch preemptive invasions whenever we want, blowing up all sorts of countries, killing all sorts of people, no international war crimes trials, no reparations at all, and he didn't get a UN resolution to invade Iraq. It was illegal, and yet he just did it, and America doesn't really even want to bring this up or talk about that. And that's exactly what the Chinese man from China was saying here. Was at 5 minutes in, he's talking about how you are criticizing us for how the Chinese treat the Muslim Uyghurs, but what about how you treated Muslims in Iraq? America doesn't want to talk about that. And then here's this Asian diplomat, see, another Asian person going, you know what, America? Yeah, you created that international rules-based order, but you kind of trashed the whole thing with the invasion of Iraq. And so you can't really be taken too seriously about how you're about the international rules-based order when you ignored all of it and received zero punishment for violating it with your invasion of Iraq. Okay, last clip. Here we go.
Towards Russia and towards Ukraine, and therefore synthesizing those views and arriving at a common position is very, very difficult, if not impossible. At the level of the United Nations, the Russian invasion of Ukraine is just the latest example. Down from 1945 to date, over the 70-odd years, we have seen the United Nations be ignored, be looked at as irrelevant by a group of hegemons, particularly those on the Security Council, when they believe that their interests are at stake. If the I remember very clearly when the United States was to go into Iraq, and the late General Powell, Colin Powell.
So you saw someone in the Diplomat, you saw somebody from China. This is news out of Lagos, Nigeria, one of the largest countries in Africa. And they too are saying international rules-based order, yeah, except when it goes against something you want, in which case you just completely ignore the whole thing. And the biggest case of you doing that was Iraq. So please spare us. So I've showed you how Indian people in India, in their own networks in India, Chinese people in their own networks from China, African people on their own networks out of Africa, all say America's not a fair partner on the rules-based order. It kind of does whatever it wants as it pleases while talking about everybody has to follow these rules, which it itself won't follow. In general, on top of that, you have the case of Iraq, which means it's really not an international rules-based order follower and should not be taken seriously on anything it says about that. These are what people in the global south who aren't white and don't live in Europe, Japan, South Korea, or America are saying. China, India, Africa, big continents, big countries. And they're saying it's not fair. It's biased. It was built by the West for the West. You don't actually mean it. You do whatever you want. And so they don't feel it's fair. And it doesn't have credibility, which is what they're saying, which is why we're going to need a new UN. And I suggest we have California. California is loved by Indians and Chinese and African people. We have a ton of Indian people here. Silicon Valley helped build the Indian economy. China has so many Chinese people and investors and people going to California schools that the premier Xi Jinping came to California first to meet Barack Obama because California is well known in the Chinese mind. Additionally, we have a lot of Russians here. One of the largest Russian populations in America is here near Sacramento near the University of Davis. And we have a lot of Latinos here. They're all having these opinions. It's not fair, and they don't buy it. I want to show you one last thing, though. So this is why everybody's talking about this now. So a lot of these countries felt the UN wasn't fair at all. And that it wasn't really a good place to get consensus on global problems in a manner that was fair. And that came to a head with this decision. The United Nations General Assembly votes to suspend Russia from the Human Rights Council. So in favor, 93 in favor, 24 against, and 58 countries said, it's not that important enough for me to be in favor or against it. Basically a way of saying, I don't want to take a side, but I'm not that upset about what Russia did. So you basically have 58 plus 24. 58 plus 24 is 70. Am I getting that right? 60 plus 20 is 82. Yeah, so you have 82 against banning Russia from the Human Rights Council and 93 for. So you have 93 countries for banning Russia from the Human Rights Council for its invasion of Ukraine. And then you have about 82 countries, or almost the same amount of countries, almost half of the planet saying, nah, I don't think it's that important. And a lot of these countries like China, Russia, India, Latin America, and the global south saw that. And they said, you know, we didn't really believe you guys were fair. You didn't really have credibility in our eyes. And so now when you want us to vote with you, we don't. And now you're getting it, UN. And now you're getting it, the West. We never really bought into your system because we felt you were unfair. And so when you want us to punish Russia, you're really only going to get half the world. And the other half isn't going to participate. So 93 to 82. That's what this is about. And that's why people are freaking out. So I'm trying to find some article saying how half the world didn't come to it. But this is basically the decision that got the entire world talking recently about how the UN isn't fair. It doesn't support an international rules-based order. Neither does America. They pick and choose what they want. And whether Americans and Europeans are aware of that, I hope that you get now that the rest of the global South sees it this way. Whether America does and whether the Europeans do, who cares? 3/4 of the planet is the global South. They aren't buying anything the West has to sell. That's the point of today's show.